I would like to announce that with me are trustees Wayne Abercrombie, Susan Mooring, Joanne Konitsky, Julie Rose, and Jack Saikowski. I am the Latham Chair, and this meeting, in accordance with Mass General Laws, Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, signed on February 15th of that year, I announce that this meeting is being recorded by Hadley Media and by Zoom for the Select Board's office. I would like to ask if there is anyone else who is recording the meeting. If not, then Susan, can you make sure that the minutes show that no one else has indicated that they are recording? Tonight's meeting is a little bit different than our usual, and we do have a number of guests with us. So I would like to just talk briefly about the way I see this meeting going forward. The purpose of the conversation with John Krupetsky, who is our project engineer from Gale Engineering, is to get a clearer understanding of the condition of the current roof and to know as much as we can about that in order to inform any next steps that we might take. There is not a predetermined outcome, and this is mostly still an information gathering activity. I would like to ask John to begin by going through the report from Gale. If at any point during his report, if that's okay with him, if trustees have questions or if the library director has questions, they are welcome to ask the questions at the time. I would ask that guests hold their questions, if they have any, until after the trustee conversation with John has concluded, and we will go from there. I would just ask everyone to be mindful of the fact that the trustees actually do have a fairly crowded agenda this evening that I would really like to try to get through. So, barring any further questions or comments, John, I would ask if you would please begin to speak.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. If for any reason the audio goes in or out, or if I'm not clear, please interrupt me. I tend to talk quickly, so and also as I kind of summarize our report, just slow me down if you want me to pause and talk about a topic in more detail. If it makes sense, I'd like to share my screen. If that works for everyone.
Please do.
Great. Okay. So, do folks have my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know how much everyone remembers from our first report, but just to bring us back, we performed an initial study on the building, which was visual only. We also utilized a drone to capture footage from far up above, different angles, and also took limited infrared scanning with that drone, which helped us kind of see some of the potential conditions below the shingles at that time. That report was provided from us to Hadley Public Library on July 3rd. Following that report, we met with Hadley Public Library in town of Hadley, on 2 occasions, and we were requested to come back to the site to perform a more invasive study of the roof to try to assess and determine what the existing construction of the roof was, and also be able to compare that to the construction drawings or the as-built drawings that were provided to us. So that is the supplemental report that I have on the screen that we provided on November 19th. Again, the purpose of this report was more to just start getting into how the roof was constructed and being able to compare it to the as-built drawings. So I'll just flip through.
John, can you expand that view? Can you enlarge it for us? Thank you.
Yeah,
Are you talking specific to the photo or
No,
just in
no,
general?
that's perfect.
that's good.
So this photo is just one example of one of the many openings we did on this roof. This was one of the larger ones that we did to try to get a better sense on how the plywood below the asphalt shingles was attached and constructed. But again, there is a section of this report which we go through in more detail all the different test cuts that were performed. Background information, a lot of this stuff was already covered under a previous report. The only thing new under document review that I included in this report had to do with just including some snippets from the as-built drawings that weren't originally provided at certain detailed locations that we opened up. The valley, as shown on the top left, the rake edge on the top right, the eave edge with the gutter and next to the metal panel roof condition on the bottom left here, and then also a typical, I believe actually there was a revision to the original, and there's a reference here to SKA11. So we just provided snippets here to help try to paint a whole picture on what may have not been abundantly clear in the first report in terms of the original as-built drawings that was provided. So that's the only update to provide right now in the document review. We did not receive any new documentation yet since the July 3rd initial report. All right. Next, test observations. So we did two things on this additional effort. We performed numerous test cuts, as I've mentioned, but we also retained a hazardous materials consultant to sample materials to look for if any asbestos-containing materials, or ACM for short, as an acronym, were present in the roof. I'll fast forward to the results of that. Anything that was collected from our hazmat consultant, Atlas, came back as no asbestos detected. That's summarized in the next section of our report, but also attached to our report is the more in-depth report from Atlas going into the specifics of the hazardous material sampling, testing, and results. So if there's ever a question on the hazmat sampling and the testing, I can get there. I suggest we focus on the test cuts here and what we found. In general, this first section here of the exploratory opening observations really just discusses the typical roof system components, the typical components from exterior to interior, include your asphalt shingles, an underlayment, 5/8 inch thick plywood sheathing, 2 layers of polyiso insulation typically totaling around 6.5 inches, self-adhering vapor barrier membrane, and that was directly over top of the 5/8 inch gypsum baseboard, which ran over top of the steel deck. So this first section here really just describes a repetitive condition that we saw on all of our openings. As we go forward in the next sections, we focus on our test cuts at the field of roof, anything that may have varied from that typical condition, and all the other detailed locations that we perform test cuts at. I'm going to quickly skip ahead. I believe as an appendix we include a far back shot showing that. I think that'll be a helpful illustration here to have on the right hand side of the screen. So let me flip to that real quick. Give it a second to load. Great. So as Appendix A, we use the as-built roof plan to mark designations of where we took all the different test cuts, numbered from 1 to 18. All of these numbers have a descriptor as well as to where on the roof it is and what that detail condition is. These numbers coincide and sync up with the test cut numbers on our report as well. That's the best way I can present this stuff to make it as clear as possible where we're doing these openings. So I hope it's helpful. Starting with the field of roof locations, typically we observed that the plywood sheathing that was directly over top of the polyiso insulation was mechanically attached down to the roof deck. It also included some insulation adhesive below the plywood, basically between the plywood and the top layer of polyiso, which tells me that the material is likely a nail-based insulation where the manufacturer glues the plywood to the top layer of the polyiso insulation. However, we don't have the submittal information to confirm that, so that's a little bit of an unknown. I don't believe it's absolutely critical to what we have found, but it's just something that if there was a submittal that identified the materials used, it would help to answer whether it's in loose layers of materials all the way up through, or if you have a nail-based insulation that was fabricated as such and brought up in one piece. I can go into that in more detail if there's any questions as to what I'm talking about there. This image here kind of shows a nice typical cross-section from bottom to top. Again, you got the steel deck, you have a gypsum layer with a baseboard, which is hard to see in this image, a little grainy. But then you have a vapor barrier, again, which was cut out so you cannot see it. Then you have one layer, 2 layers of polyiso, your plywood sheathing, there's an underlayment that exists as well, and then your asphalt shingle. So just a nice cross-section showing a typical roof assembly. And I don't know how in-depth you want me to go with our observations, so I'm going to try to stay more summarized here. Again, slow me down if you have questions. Where we did observe the adhesive layer between the top plywood and the first uppermost layer of insulation, the ribbon spacing was typically 5 inches on center, which told me that a regular spacing was intentionally applied between those materials. Again, we can't confirm if that was field applied or if it was factory applied at this time. At one of our field of roof test cuts, we did perform that test cut that coincided with a buckling asphalt shingle location. Once we opened that condition up, we saw that there were wrinkles in the felt underlayment, shown in this image here. A little bit difficult to see, but we outlined the area that was wrinkled. We further cut into that underlayment, and it coincided with joints in the plywood sheathing below. When we looked a little bit closer, we saw that some edges of the plywood were sunken inward more, apparently due to overdriven fasteners. And we also observed some areas of underdriven fasteners elsewhere on our test cuts. Some of the fasteners were also rusted as well. It's not uncommon, depending on how the contractor temporarily protected the roof as these materials are going into place, that fasteners can see moisture and the plywood deck can see moisture. I don't want to go into specifics or really opine on the construction practices implemented at this time, because again, we haven't really been provided with project-specific correspondence that talks about how these materials were constructed or the sequencing, weather protection, all that stuff. We can't really comment on that at this time because we don't have that documentation. This report purely really just documents what we saw from our test cuts. So let me go to the next page. Here's a good example of a wrinkle in the membrane, a wrinkle in the underlayment, which coincided with the buckled asphalt shingle. Cutting that away, another example of the plywood boards not being, perfectly aligned with each other, or at least there was enough of a gap that varying, that non-flush surface appeared to be the cause of that buckling asphalt shingle in this particular area. An example of an underdriven fastener. This photo here shows that when you construct these type of roofs, whether it's a low slope or a steep slope, and you have your multiple layers of insulation, this photo does show that they staggered the insulation joints, which is a positive out of the way they constructed the insulation. That helps to reduce the potential for air and cold to follow those joints. If it hits this joint and then you don't have another joint right here, then it's just harder for that airflow to go through, which is a good thing. So moving forward, still we're on the field of roof topic. I think the next one we'll be talking about is eave. Test cut 15 we had planned to do, but we didn't get around to it because it was duplicative. So I didn't throw off the order of the numbers on our final roof plan here. We just note the fact that test cut 15 was not performed. Test cut 16, another field of roof condition, also coincided with an buckling asphalt shingle. When we opened it, we did not see any obvious potential causes of why it was buckling in that area. But it was a very small opening compared to some other ones, so there may have been something that we just didn't uncover by not removing more material. I believe this one was pretty close to the end of the day number 2 being out there. So everyone was interested in patching everything up before running out of time. Test cut 17, another field of roof, coincided with what I'm calling a roof anomaly from our initial study. Roof anomaly, if you're not familiar with that term, is when you do an infrared scan. It's scanning for temperature variances within the roof assembly, and it's using different colors to designate hot. Hot might be a redder color, blue might be a colder color. This happened to be an opening where we saw that color variation, and what we found was there was wet plywood sheathing and wet insulation layers below, or really basically where we located the test cut at that anomaly, we confirmed there was wet materials below the asphalt shingles. So we're trying to gather this data on using what we learned from our first study, and we found some causes of the asphalt shingle buckling. We found some wet materials below the asphalt shingles as suspected. So a lot of good data came from this. We performed test cuts moving from the field of the roof to the next detail location would be the roof eave and rake locations. In general, the construction appeared to be in general accordance with the as-built drawings that were provided to us. There were some subtle differences, and it wasn't clear based on what we saw whether or not the roof vapor barrier continued over the edge and tied continuously with the wall vapor barrier, which the drawings call for. So there's a little bit of unknown there. In order to be able to fully understand that, we would have to really made a larger opening, removed the wood blocking shown in these images, and potentially disturb some of the wall cladding materials, which is really beyond the capabilities with the time we had on site and the capabilities of the roofing contractor that was helping us to be able to confirm that. But that's just one kind of a little bit of an unknown. You do want your roof vapor barrier to tie continuously with your wall vapor barrier. There's a little bit of an unknown with that, given what we saw. Again, as we go forward, what I'm trying to document in these test cuts is anything that deviates either from the as-built drawings or anything that is unique that was not covered in the typical observations from our typical assembly. So here's another eave opening. We did notice a very large gap in the plywood sheathing here. And we noticed a gap in the insulation that's probably should have been filled in. The drawings do call for spray foam insulation at all of the budding insulation layers at all the detail locations, the ridge, the eave, the rakes, the valleys, and we didn't see any spray foam insulation out there. That is something that did not conform to the as-built drawings, which we talked about in this report. Moving from the eave up to the ridge location. Try to get for folks not familiar with the roof nomenclature. When I say field of the roof, we're talking really just the middle of the roof or anywhere that's away from a rising wall or a perimeter of the roof. The eave is the downslope edge, normally where you see gutters and stuff on buildings. My highlighter is not working. There we go. This is an example of an eave here. The rake is when you have the side of the roof as it goes up slope. This is an example of a rake. Here's another example of a rake. And then when I use the term ridge, although the drawings incidentally call it a rake up here, the ridge is the top center or the high point of the roof, all right? So when we did our test cuts at the ridge, there were some areas where we observed thicker than the 6.5 typical insulation. There were areas where we saw the way they framed the rakes, the blocking didn't necessarily come in contact, and there were some varying heights there. There were some gaps in the insulation, like we talked about similarly at the eave. There was no spray foam here. And there were areas where the vapor barrier kind of, although it appeared generally continuous over the ridge, there were areas where it was not supported by a continuous solid substrate, which is usually just something that the vapor barrier, the roofing manufacturer requires of their vapor barrier. Nothing really jumped out as being that much of a large-scale deviation from the as-built drawings at the ridge, but there were just some subtle differences that we noticed. We did do a test cut at a ridge that coincided with a buckling asphalt shingle. When we removed it, we did observe that the plywood sheathing board on one side was higher than the other. And we saw that the plywood sheathing was separating a little bit from the insulation as well. So we think this was likely a contributor to the buckling in that case. We saw an underdriven fastener. So why these things are occurring, maybe they were there from the start. Hard to say without having more information and not being there during construction. But these are just things that, this is an example of uneven substrate below the asphalt shingles that projected through and caused the buckling asphalt shingle in that location. See if there's anything else to note here. Let me just scan. Not too much else to note, just more of the typical same with the gap of insulation at the ridge. This shows an example of how that gap appears to be pretty continuous along the ridge. Really that should be butt tight to the insulation of the other side, and as needed, they should have used spray foam insulation to try to create that continuity of that thermal barrier. We did some other various test cuts. We did the roof to the clear story wall. Let me see if I have a good image to pull up here. 1 second. When I say clear story wall, I'm talking this lower roof to a rising wall here, this clear story wall. We did a test cut along there. This is a location where there's been reported leakage in the past. I can't recall if a sealant remediation effort has happened yet, but there was talks that there would be a separate sealant remediation project or replacement project around these clear story windows and components. Most of what we saw was in general accordance with the as-built drawings. There were some, again, minor deviations. They did not have wood blocking beneath the glass fiber reinforced concrete sills, even though the as-built drawings called for it. As we started trying to look closer, it was challenging. Again, we didn't really have the capabilities at the time to start removing cladding materials, which would have helped paint the full cross-section detail to be able to fully assess if this whole detail meets the as-built drawings, but we kept it at roof level, and from what we could see, it was mostly in accordance with the as-built drawings. Again, some subtle differences. Let's see if there's anything else to note about that detail. Again, we would expect that the vapor barrier on the roof vapor barrier should upturn and make a connection with the wall vapor barrier, but given that we didn't remove the sagging materials, we did see it turn upwards in our opening, but we could not confirm that continuous connection with the wall, given what we opened up. We say roof to cheek wall is our next opening. Looking at the far back image I had up previously, We refer to a cheek wall as this, basically it's a rake condition, but at a rising wall, right? If this is a rake edge here, it's the same idea, but when you have a wall rising up above it. So we did perform a test cut there. We performed it at a location adjacent to where we saw some of those roof anomalies before. And we did find that there were wet materials, both in the plywood sheathing and the plywood insulation layers below that. So it helped to support the anomalies that we saw from our IR scan. And I hate to be a broken record, but again, given that we didn't get into the wall material removal, it was hard to see if the roof vapor barrier connected with the wall vapor barrier. And I can go into explaining why that's important later. Test cut in the valley, very similar construction to the as-built, just another example of the insulation not being continuous where the valley, where the insulation meets in the valley, so there were gaps there, even though the drawings called for spray foam. We did some test cut where the metal roof exists or next to it just to see if there was any major differences there. Mostly was in accordance with the as-built drawings. Hip roof, similar. You have gaps in the insulation, no spray foam. We did observe rust on one of the screws used to attach the plywood. So I want to take a quick step back. One thing we did observe with the metal roof in looking closer is that there were cracked solder joints at one corner. Probably hard to see on the screen here, but the arrows point to the basically the limits or the extents of where that cracked solder was observed. A condition like that may or may not allow water below it, depending on how that roof is constructed. If it's a fully lap locked and soldered joint, there's still a chance it's watertight, but we didn't cut into it to confirm. As far as we know, this area did not have reported leakage. So we left it to visual observations only where this crack solder existed. All right, that was a lot of information, probably a little bit challenging to follow as I hopped over on the roof, but as you read the report, I think it does a good job in explaining what we saw in more detail. The next section, as I discussed previously, is the hazardous material testing findings, just summarizing that whatever was collected came back as no asbestos detected. There were 87 samples collected by Atlas. Before I move forward, is there anything folks want to fall back on photos, something that you may have read or saw that you would like to flip back to before I go into our discussions and opinions?
John, can you just, because I don't know if everyone is aware of it, can you point out where that section of metal roof is? That's
Sure.
next to, I guess it was it cut 12?
Yeah, test cut 12 here. Sometimes plan view is hard to get a full picture here. Let me pull up the aerial view. This probably helps you more. It's right here.
Yeah.
So, just out, definitely with that crack solder, keep an eye out, look at your ceiling. If you're seeing any stains below this area, it could very well be contributed or attributed to the condition of that crack solder.
John, can I ask you a question about test cut number 17 on page 6? You note some black discoloration on the underside of the bottom polyiso, and in
Number 17 here. Yep, I see it.
Is that just a discoloration, or is there potential for that to be mold?
We are not certified hygienists or industrial hygienists, nor are we certified to identify the presence of mold. It was at a location where there was moisture, where there was wet materials.
Mhm.
As many of us know, mold can grow in areas of prolonged wetting, right? So there is a potential that that's with mold growth, but we're not certified to call it that. So
That's fine.
for all intents and purposes, I call it black discoloration because that's what it was, and it was on the underside, below the materials that were wet. So
Is that
Yes, I
the
can
only
leave it at
place
that.
that was noticed?
the black discoloration. Let me try to.
I don't recall seeing it elsewhere in the report.
Let's double check. Yeah, that was the only place we observed at our test cut locations. We did observe more than one location where there were wet materials, but that's the only location where we observed that black discoloration on the underside.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the exploratory test cuts or photos?
One other quick question. You noticed
Sure.
variability in the depth, the total depth of the insulation. Is that in any way significant?
I don't think it is. It's just an observation. Typically, what we saw is most locations was 6.5 inches. The lowest we saw was 5 3/4. We didn't fully dig into why that may be or how it may impact the levelness of the roof. In some areas, maybe it's just how the insulation's coming into some of those detailed framing conditions below. But even at the lowest, at 5 3/4, I believe, that's still an R30 roof. So they installed enough insulation on this roof to meet the energy code requirement minimum of R30, even at the lowest or the thinnest areas from what we could observe.
Is there any reason to think that the insulation in the lesser areas would have been due to compression? And would compression have any impact on the rating?
I don't think so.
Okay.
For insulation to compress significantly, there has to be really high load applied to it. Polyiso insulation, if installed and in service and remains dry, we haven't really seen instances of it compressing to a point where you're losing, inches or countable inches of thickness. Polyiso, though, can be impacted when it's wet. It can lose its useful R value. I think prolonged wetting can also impact its integrity, but I don't expect compression to be a reason for that variance for this instance.
Thank you.
John, it's my recollection when you met with us a while back, you talked about ventilation with this roof. Are you going to go there at all in this report?
Yeah, so in the discussion, and well, I'll first start by saying confirmed. I mean, even before we did test cuts, there were no ventilation provisions, and the test cuts just showed that there's no dedicated air gap in there that would have even allowed for ventilation of the system. So in our discussion and observation section, I tried to have these bullets align with our first report. In that way, I could provide any supplemental information that we found that might help to bring our previous unknowns forward on those topics. So I think in here, lack of ventilation provisions, Gale's prior findings have not changed as a result of the exploratory openings. There are no ventilation provisions for this asphalt shingle roof. So hopefully that answers your question.
All right, thanks.
Can you talk about the, you noted that through more or less wherever you did the cuts where there was a gap that would have, that should have called for spray foam insulation. Can you talk about the effect of the lack of insulation in those areas and on the overall effectiveness of the insulation of the roof?
Sure. The building code calls for continuous thermal insulation, continuous thermal barrier. They missed the mark there at those detail locations, the valley, the ridge, the hips, the eaves. How does it impact the overall performance of the building? you may have some more, increased areas of ineffective, thermal insulation of those areas, ineffective resistance to the elements outside, whether it's cold or heat. So you might have increased, energy. There may be an impact to the energy costs to heat and cool the building as a result. But in general, though, we're talking about a pretty small sample size with respect to the whole roof. They did, like I mentioned earlier, they had 2 layers of insulation, which is better than just one. And they also staggered the joints between the layers, which helps the roof resist the cold air or hot air from penetrating through. So I don't anticipate that gap in insulation at those detail areas are significantly impacting the performance of the roof. And I don't believe it has any direct cause to the buckling asphalt shingles that we had observed. Any other questions before I summarize our discussions, opinions, and I guess next steps?
Go ahead.
Okay. So as I mentioned, with the goal of trying to copy the previous topics from our last report and bring forth any supplemental information on those topics, that's how we laid out the discussion and opinion section. So in summary, general shingle installation, we did observe at numerous of the test cuts that they had 6 ring shank nails per shingle, which is pretty standard for hurricane attachment, so that's a good thing. We did not really uncover any signs of under or overdriven fasteners. At this time, we don't believe the actual shingle attachment and the methods to attach the shingles are correlating to the buckling asphalt shingle condition, given what we observed there. Next, we talked about uneven deck substrates. We did, from our test cuts, observe numerous locations where there were uneven substrates in the plywood. Some areas it appeared to be caused by under or overdriven fasteners, where one side of the joint is higher than the other side of the joint. That deviation appears to have projected through into the asphalt shingles. Was it there from day one? We can't tell. If it was a straight up installation issue, we would expect that there's a very good chance that that condition would have existed from day one, and potentially that buckled asphalt shingle could have very well existed from day one. You'd have to remind me I'd have to go back in my notes or remind me when the first time you noticed the buckling asphalt shingles was, in terms of when substantial completion was met. So that's something we can kind of talk about more in discussion if you'd like to go there. But we did observe uneven deck substrates from our test cuts at some areas. We talk about if there were areas where the plywood truly was bonded or adhered to the materials below and there were no mechanical fasteners, that can be something that could result in movement if they was not installed properly. It's not usually typical that you see fully bonded systems without any mechanical attachment when you have a steep slope roof. Having that submittal information would help to just kind of put that idea to a close. And our sample sizes, our test cuts, except for the one rather large area that we did, were pretty small. So it was hard to be able to see the amount of fasteners used. Maybe some of the openings were done between the fasteners that way, and that's why we didn't see any, because the opening size was so small. So again, having that submittal information would help to identify that, or shop drawing information, if that exists, would help to further support or explain how these materials were constructed. On a similar note, we didn't cover large enough areas and expose the steel deck to try to show if the steel framing, the steel deck itself, had variations in it that may have caused the materials above to become off kilter. We couldn't assess that as well as part of this effort, as the size of the openings were relatively small. But what the goal again of this section is just to try to provide additional thoughts that were not present prior. Anything that may be pertinent to the cause of these shingles, we're trying to touch on here. Another topic is movement within the roof assembly itself can be a cause of asphalt shingle buckling. We did observe in some areas that the plywood sheathing directly below the asphalt shingles in the underlayment had fastener spacing of 30 inches horizontally by 12 vertically. It was hard to confirm that in most areas because the openings were so small. And also on the underside of the roof deck, there's finished ceilings in most areas, so it's hard to be, we didn't really make any openings to try to look up above the ceiling to try to look for those fasteners coming through. So we didn't spend that extra effort to quantify and check the spacing of the fasteners. If there are areas on the roof where there's insufficient fastening, that can be a cause of movement within the assembly, especially if there's those significant wind events that may start moving materials. During our initial study, there was an area of drop ceiling, I believe, that we looked up above and we could see the fasteners on the coming through the deck. So at least in that area, from our first report, we saw evidence that the fasteners appeared to be sufficiently long to penetrate that steel deck, and there was somewhat regular spacing of those fasteners within that area. So this third bullet here talks about, again, is it plywood sheathing loose over top of loose insulation, or is there a nail-based insulation? We did observe that the plywood sheathing joints appear to be but relatively tight. Some literature out there proposes having a gap between plywood sheathing boards to allow for thermal movement. But I think we've seen instances that having the plywood butt tight, provided that the materials are installed properly in dry conditions and so on and so forth, may not result in a negative side effect there. So if determined it was nail-based insulation, there may be some supplemental information we can provide based on what those manufacturers, those materials require. We just can't get there yet because we don't know how, if it's nail-based insulation or if it's loose. And then from what we saw, although our openings were not large enough to confirm from our IR scan, it did appear that the orientation of the plywood sheathing, so they're 4 foot by 8 foot boards typically. Industry standard tells you want the longer 8 foot dimension to be parallel with your eave or your ridge. From our IR study and the first go around, that's what it appeared to be, because you can see the joints coming through. But to fully confirm that, larger areas would need to be opened up. We didn't see that to be absolutely unnecessary, nor do we have time to do openings that large during this additional study. We talked about ventilation provisions. There are none. Nothing changed there. Having or not having a continuous vapor barrier on the roof, well, you want a continuous vapor barrier on your roof, and you want your roof vapor barrier to tie with your wall vapor barrier for the pure reason that you want that vapor drive to be stopped. And you know, if there's humidity within the building, it helps to stop the migration of that humidity into your roof assembly. From what we saw in the field of roof test cuts and everywhere else, there was a vapor barrier. That's great. But we could not confirm if and how that roof vapor barrier ties to the wall vapor barrier. We also could not confirm how field-to-field lap joints were constructed, but generally we saw that there was a vapor barrier. All right. Let me see. Presence of moisture and humidity in the roof. I had mentioned in our IR study we noted observed anomalies, and our test cuts did show that there was wet materials at a number of those anomalies. So there is some moisture in the system. Where did that moisture come from? At least in one area here. Let me see if I can. This is the first July 3rd report. I'll just quickly scan to our IR image here. We did a test cut at this anomaly right here. That was wet. That's like in a field of roof condition. We couldn't really determine why there was moisture there at that particular location because it's so isolated. Maybe there was a hole at some point prior and it was repaired. We couldn't fully tell. This anomaly here is directly adjacent to that clear story wall, which I believe folks from the Public Library had reported prior leakage at that clear story wall. So I think this area is more likely than not attributed to either an active leak or a prior leak at that clear story wall condition. We did a test cut at this cheek wall here next to this anomaly and found wet materials. We do comment on the construction of the through-wall flashing at those cheek walls and how it's not necessarily to the best industry standard practice, but as we did not remove materials or perform water testing, we could not fully assess whether or not that cheek wall and those flashing conditions are an active leaker. But again, here you are right next to adjacent to the clear story that was previously leaking. So it's a very good chance that at a minimum, this area here, clear story, could have contributed to this anomaly here. So let me flip back. Some additional findings that we saw, we touched on this already, the insulation thickness varies. Typically it's 6.5, even at the lowest, you still have that minimum code R30, and you have that 2 layers, which is great. That's what you want, to be able to have staggered joints, and that's what they provided from what we saw. Here we talk about the reported water infiltration at the clear story wall. It does appear to be associated with, so I didn't touch on this yet during this meeting here. But from what we saw, those joints, those sealant joints in the glass fiber reinforced concrete panels and the windows where they meet those panels is generally deteriorated. So let me ask, has there been any update or has there been any efforts to have those sealants replaced based on prior discussions that we had? I don't know if Patrick.
Yeah, that has been addressed. I believe it was addressed over the summer.
It was addressed over the summer.
Sometime this year it was done. So since the time of the first report, that was done.
Do you recall the magnitude of that sealant replacement work? What I mean that is, did they do both clear story walls? Did they hit all of these joints here? Basically anywhere you have a panel to panel or a window to panel joint?
That I could not tell you. I couldn't tell you that level of detail, but my understanding was that, as I understand it, it seemed like some of the material that was expected to be there around the windows, it had never been installed to begin with. It wasn't that it had deteriorated, it just wasn't there, they hadn't done it.
Gotcha. So I think we went out there, let me see, page 12. We went out there the second time here on October 16th and 17th when we did this exploratory test cut work. And we made an additional observation that the sealant at those rising walls were still deteriorated. So it's something you want to look at probably a little bit closer.
Yeah.
The sealant, all these sealant joints here, I don't want to say all of them, but there are evidence of deteriorated sealant. Depending on how that roof ties in with the wall there, this could very well still be an active leaker for you and potentially still adding water into your roof assembly below.
Okay.
Our hazmat consultant did collect samples of the sealant, I believe. I have to double check the report. And again, no asbestos was detected in the sealant. Not super surprising given your building's 5 years old, but we have had instances where newer construction has shown, and Patrick, you and I talked about, how that can be and the need to have testing done prior to any demolition practices, which is why we proceeded with that survey for this effort here, right? But it's good. It's good there's no asbestos containing material in the samples collected. Lastly, we talk about that cheek wall again here. We didn't do water testing to confirm if it's actively leaking. There is a chance that a driven rain under the right conditions could result in leakage, given the previous reported leakage in the area. So we did do a test cut there, and the materials were wet. In summary, well, some of the stuff is reiterative of what we said prior in the July 3rd report, but buckling asphalt shingles could reduce the overall service life of the roof system. The reason there is you have a condition where the asphalt shingles buckled. Asphalt shingles typically have a bituminous strip along the front edge that's supposed to help keep that shingle down during wind-driven rain events, but also help keep wind-driven rain out. If that wrinkle extends through that seal, it's a potential entry point for water to blow up underneath the asphalt shingle in that area and could potentially get to the underlayment below. Is one reason why we're saying this first bullet. The second reason is if the asphalt shingles, and this would, I don't know if folks on the call have noticed this or not. If you have, please chime in. But in some instances, we've seen that buckling, where we have seen on other projects, buckling asphalt shingles, sometimes during the day or during certain seasons, the buckling is more pronounced. Some areas it sometimes disappears, but that action of buckle coming flat could fatigue the material, which could also reduce the service life of the asphalt shingles itself. So that's the discussion on the first bullet. I talked about this second bullet here in the initial report. So GAF had done an initial warranty inspection, given the documentation, Patrick, that you had provided, and they we can go into more details, but they basically said what they observed was not covered under their warranty. I will say though, what we're seeing now is a lot more widespread than what that report talks about. So is there an opportunity for you folks to contact GAF again, to have them come back out, do another inspection, given that what they said in their first report is not fully true anymore? Yes, there's that opportunity. You might want to consider doing that. Will anything come from it? I can't tell you. You know, it can't hurt to have them come out and look at the roof again, given that the conditions have changed. Hopefully there's an opportunity there to get more information or getting some support in replacing some of these materials, but it's just it's something to consider. Third bullet, we already talked about this. Those clear story sealants should be replaced as soon as possible, given what we saw. It'd be great to know what the magnitude of that replacement effort was over the summer. That's well documented. So, A, you could re-inspect those areas to see if that sealant took and if it was installed properly. But B, there appear to be original sealant areas still, and that sealant generally does not appear to be in good condition. Fourth bullet, we have not opined on responsibility for the conditions observed, responsibility being the original construction team parties. We're not getting into that, nor have we been asked to get into that. If we are asked to get into that level of opinion and assessment, more project documentation would need to be provided. Things like submittals, the actual contract documents versus the as-built documents. Specifications, we have not been provided specifications, and then there's that whole other slew of construction administration documentation from field reports to meeting minutes, none of which was provided to us to date. This fifth bullet here, some resolutions to consider is removing and replacing the asphalt shingle roof with an unvented roof assembly, basically a roof assembly that is expected to perform with no ventilation. Asphalt shingles, on the other hand, in our region, typically manufacturers require ventilation. Without ventilation, it's well documented that reduced service life can occur as the shingle can get overheated. It's a term called shingle bake. Sometimes if a shingle bake condition happens, you're seeing a little bit more curling of the edges and a little bit more widespread regular failing of the asphalt shingles. But going back to the point of this bullet, one resolution to consider would be swapping out the asphalt shingles with a system that does not require ventilation, since there are no provisions currently. Things like natural slate, probably too expensive. Synthetic shingle materials, there are, plastic, for the lack of a better term, plastic slate materials and cedar materials that do not require ventilation. There are single ply roof membranes, some of which have faux standing seam batten strips that can be welded on, but you could also go with a sheet metal roofing system as well. Just some thoughts as you weigh your options on what you want to do with this roof.
John, if you went that route, would you have to remove the asphalt shingles before you laid on the other?
The building code allows you to recover an existing roof assembly once. I believe it's how it reads. I think in this instance, you would want to remove the asphalt shingles, absolutely, for a couple of reasons. You want to replace any wet materials underneath the asphalt shingles, so that's a little bit more of an isolated repair condition that you would want to do regardless. How do you see that without removing everything? You might want to perform a more in-depth IR survey, given that we've seen anomalies have shown wet areas. Doing a little more in-depth IR survey with a drone at the right temperature conditions, like wintertime is usually a pretty good time to do it because you have the heating. Anywhere the heat's escaping, you'll see those hot spots with your IR study. And wet materials act differently from dry materials too, especially with the insulation. So that should pop up pretty good at this time of year. The other reason you would want to remove all the asphalt shingles is if there's any discontinuity in the underlayment, there's your time to fix it. Some of these materials require other substrate or underlayment materials like sheet metal roofing. It's beneficial to have slip sheets in there. Sometimes you want a high temperature membrane underneath those, given that the metal panel roof gets so hot. So yeah, you'd want to remove the asphalt shingles. You'd also want to confirm that your deck, your sheathing substrate below is properly attached. The only way of doing that is stripping the roof off and exposing that plywood. And you also want to correct any uneven surfaces, because still with a metal panel roof, for example, there's a condition they call oil canning when you have metal panel roofing, where it's not a construction defect, nor is it usually something that is deemed a flaw and something that's not warrantable with those sheet metal panel manufacturers. But it's a condition when you're looking at the certain light, you see a little bit of waviness in the metal panel. And many owners that have it can find that to be objectionable. There are ways to design around that and try to limit the potential for oil canning, but definitely having a smooth, flat substrate with metal panel roofs is important for the reason of that oil canning. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. So yes, you want to remove the asphalt shingles.
Thank you.
The other option you have here is going to a vented asphalt shingle roof. Given the way the roof's constructed without ventilation, you likely have to get into modification of your eave details, your rake details, potentially modifying some of the siding materials in those areas if you're trying to bump the whole roof system up to provide a ventilation path. There is a way to provide, so the way ventilation works, I forget if I went into this last time, but you have an intake ventilation at the low side of the roof, and then you have exhaust at the high point. So air flows up underneath the asphalt shingles and back out to help cool and remove any moisture in the system. There is a way to provide that intake by cutting a field of roof slot in that plywood sheathing, or basically you're cutting a slot in there up or upslope from that eave condition, so you're still getting that path. The negative side effect there is that does result in a shadow line, as that gap is typically 1 inch high So it's just an aesthetic change to the building, if that's something that would be considered. So all these options would really need to be vetted out as part of a schematic design phase, and input on the town and the library's budget to do so is going to be important moving forward if replacing the roof is an option. That brings us to the final 2 points, and I swear I'll stop talking, but I'm here happy to answer questions. This first additional consideration talks about that IR study that I mentioned. So if the ultimate decision is that you want to keep the roof as is and live with it to get some number of years out of it, we do suggest that the wet materials are replaced, and anything causing any active leakage into the system is addressed as well. Using a more in-depth IR survey can help you identify those areas and potentially hone in on areas that require remediation. We do talk about patching a 5-year-old asphalt shingle roof with new asphalt shingles will be noticeable, especially on day 1, year 1, year 5 potentially, but over time, if the right shingles are selected, that color variation will blend in a little bit better. The second bullet is if roof replacement is determined to be the next step forward, moving forward with that schematic design is the next reasonable step, and we would, someone would need to have, or Hadley Public Library and Town of Hadley would need to be involved in those discussions so we can understand the aesthetic goals, budgetary goals, so on and so forth. So with that, I think that, apologies, that took me an hour to get through, but hopefully it was helpful. Happy to answer any questions.
Are there any additional trustee questions for John?
Are we having this is a process question for you. So right now we're just asking questions of John, not like discussing the issue between us, right?
The point is just to have as clear an understanding as possible of what is up on top of the roof, and to understand where problems might be, and to have some idea about what the options are to address them. We're not making any decisions about
Thank you.
next steps, because we don't know what those would be.
Yeah.
Do any of the guests in the room or guests online have questions for John?
This is Mark Sullivan. I'll let Phil speak to the design of the roof system and the non-ventilation, but I can say that it was intentional and it was installed as designed. It's called a hot roof system, but I can let Phil speak to that. But I think in general, the report showed, the infrared report showed a couple anomalies which were below the clear story, and the clear story section of the building, it was determined, there are areas of either caulk that had failed or caulk that wasn't installed. So I think we have more of a caulking issue than a roofing issue. I think, the infrared showed the field roof, and the report, the test cuts showed that in general there were some areas where they didn't have spray foam and so forth where they should have. But in general, those weren't of such a nature that those could have caused a leak, I don't think, in my opinion. So I think where we did see areas of water infiltration at the clear story, that's an obvious indication of, below the infrared showed where wet plywood was and where we might have had a leak show itself on the inside. That's because nothing was caught up top, and so that makes sense to me. There was a nail board insulation. John mentioned didn't know because they didn't have the documentation. Was it loose insulation, loose plywood adhered in the field? It wasn't. It was done by the manufacturer. So it was a Hunter panel, I think, was the manufacturer, which is a standard panel in the industry. And then the vapor barrier was continuous. It did go up over the roof, down the sides, and so forth. So the whole building was wrapped, or should have been wrapped. So those are the few points that I got out of the report, and I appreciate John's thoroughness through everything.
I just want to touch on that real quick, Mark. I think I agree that a majority of the anomalies were present on that lower roof adjacent to the clear story. There were still, the original reason why we were contacted, I believe, had to do with the buckling asphalt shingle condition. Buckling asphalt shingles are occurring pretty regularly elsewhere on the roof as well, beyond or on the upper slope where there is no clear story. So I don't want to lose sight of that. That was the initial reason we were contacted. And some of our test cuts at those areas did show uneven substrate directly below. Typically also showed it occurring at the joints of the plywood sheathing, or as you're now mentioning, which is likely the nail-based insulation, that composite board. So I just want to make sure that was clear to folks on the call, that it's not just the moisture here, it's the buckling that's occurring elsewhere too.
Bruce?
Was the lack of ventilation built into the design, or is this just not happening?
It was, Phil, I don't know if you want to speak to that, to the design.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, I can speak about, this is Philip Ryan at Johnson Robertson, and as Mark says, we did design the roof as a hot roof. There is certainly some benefit to providing some ventilation under the shingles in terms of adding some light to the shingles themselves so that they don't get too hot. The biggest thing that ventilation does, and I think if you look online, you'll find a bunch of literature, which is essentially, the majority of it will be about residential roofing. But given that we have continuous insulation on the outside of the building, where we see that there is a benefit to some longevity on the shingles, we are not typically convinced that overall you're providing a better system for a shingle, but maybe not a better system for the building as a whole. Because this ventilation also allows any moisture that builds up inside the system to evaporate out. It also is a pathway for moisture to enter into the system, and so it becomes kind of a continuous problem with insulation taking on a little bit more water due to vapor in different times of the year and then drying out at other times of the year. There's literature written about both, and there are pros and cons for both. We had the discussion with the building committee on designing a closed or hot roof. Given the amount of insulation that we have, we weren't too concerned about things like heat loss causing ice dams and icicles on the building, and I don't believe that you have those kinds of problems, which is one of the biggest things that ventilating can help to avoid. But yeah, it was a calculated decision during the design phase to not ventilate the space under the shingles.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I just have a question about whether that discussion happened on the building committee, and maybe nobody knows, before it was decided to go with asphalt, or after the change. Remember, originally we were going to go with a metal roof, and we switched to asphalt. So I just wonder at what point the decision for the hot roof happened, and did it take into account either roof material? Is that a clear question? Yeah, I think.
I do recall talking about metal roofing. It was everybody's first choice. Frankly, it was our first choice. We would love to put a metal roof in this building. Metal roofs are ventilated, by the way. They're vented between the plywood and the metal itself for the most part. They stand up on little clips that hold them up off the roof a little bit so the air can flow underneath them. It's kind of built into the system. So, but you'll recall the cost was the issue. I know that we talked about it. I think pretty on, we probably advised that we didn't think you could afford it. We did talk about asphalt shingles pretty early on in the design. much before we got into the working drawings and started drawing an unventilated roof. The last time I think we talked about metal roofing was as a potential for an add alternate. I don't recall if we actually
Yeah.
went out to bid
Okay.
with that add alternate on there or not, but we've gone back to look at the drawings.
Thanks for the reminder, Phil.
Sure.
Do you remember what the difference in cost was between asphalt and metal?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
some
it was,
you all may remember.
Yeah,
it was very significant.
It was significant.
Right.
Can you put a
Oh,
figure on
yeah, it
that?
was
Hundreds of thousands.
100,000.
Yeah.
like that.
500,000?
Hundreds of thousands, I don't remember how many hundreds of thousands, but it was a significant difference.
Yeah. And I do recall talking about what the potential benefits would be for clipping a potential photovoltaic array to the standing seams as well, and how that would have
Yeah.
saved us a little time and worry that we wouldn't have had with an asphalt shingle. The other thing that an unvented asphalt shingle roof provides for us is a more secure platform to attach photovoltaics to, because you don't have that void directly below the sheeting that you have to deal with.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm sorry. Do you have an opinion on whether you should stick with the asphalt roof or change to some other kind of roof at this point?
Are you asking me, Johnson?
Yeah, I'm
Martins?
asking you, Mr. O'Brien.
Okay, well, if you were putting your own money in town, I would say, put a new roof on your building.
Yeah.
But knowing the town as I do,
Uh-huh.
and that's only as well as I know you all in the library, it seems like the most prudent thing to do would be to try to get as many years out of the asphalt shingle roof that you have now, and think about potentials for replacement when it's time to replace that roof. It may have a reduced overall lifespan, as John has said, but that's not nearly as reduced as tearing it off next year. Your life of your roof ends next year if you rip it off then. But that's your decision to make.
So Phil, my guess is you're still with Johnson Roberts and still designing public buildings and things like that. What are you recommending for current roof systems on new libraries?
We have found, we've had a couple of projects in the last 30 years or so that we've designed public buildings where we've had some amount of shingle buckling. And we've had various roofing consultants come out and review them. And no offense, John, lots of times the responses that we get are different. I don't know what causes it, to tell you the truth, but we've had different responses from different folks. Now, in cases where there's an uneven seam in the plywood and you open up the roof and that's where the buckle is, that's pretty clear. That's what's going on there. But we've had some other cases where the seams have wrinkled, and we have had gaps between the edges of the plywood or the OSB, and other cases where we haven't. There has been cases where we've had shingle buckling on roofs that are ventilated and others that aren't. And because we've designed both hot roofs and ventilated roofs in similar circumstances. What I see as kind of, when I look back at all the different instances where we've run into this ourselves, and I think this is the third time in 30 years or so where we've run into it ourselves, and then I've also looked into it for other projects, looking for precedent and so forth, trying to satisfy myself. When I look at what the difference is, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this, John or Mark, but as we add more and more insulation, the fasteners that we're using to screw this insulation between that top layer of plywood of the nail board and the deck are so long that when expansion and contraction happens, those fasteners don't do anything because they're so long, they just go back and forth when those upper panels expand and contract or move, whether they're taking on water or giving up water because there's either water in the system because it's vented, which, as I mentioned before, allows vapor to enter directly under the bottom of the sheathing, or they're unvented, and you're trapping moisture inside the system somehow, whether it's leaking from a bird's mouth in the AVB underneath from inside the building, whether it's getting up, whether it's chasing one of these spots where there's a void in the insulation. Cold air is going to try to make its way through there, and the air and vapor barrier is supposed to stop that, but if there's a pinhole there, it's going to bring a lot of water vapor with it. And that can actually look like a roof leak when the water condenses inside that void. So it's hard to know exactly what the best solution is there. And as we add more and more insulation as the years go by, and the stretch code gets harder and harder to comply with, we're looking now for better solutions. One of the solutions that we had looked at has a solid wood spline at each of the joints in the plywood top sheet. And so when you lay the two sheets together, there's a solid piece of wood underneath them. When you screw them together, they both go through the same piece of wood, the spline in between, and it locks the two sheets together. And that may help some expansion and contraction from happening on the top layer, which we think may be leading to some of the buckling. I don't really know what the answer is. Sometimes it occurs on some buildings, rarely, and not others, and I can't really figure out why. Like I said, I've seen it happen in various circumstances, vented and unvented.
So I'm happy to add some thoughts to that. One thing we're not really able to, again, to talk about here is the construction practices implemented on this project. But certainly one instance that, one thing that can happen is if wood materials are installed in place and their moisture content is above and beyond what it should be, that can result in unforeseen conditions of movement of the wood as it dries out after installation. So the other thing too is after the wood's installed, if it's not properly weather protected, you could have those adverse effects which could be causing some movement or swelling of the plywood materials after initial installation and prior to weatherization. So there's that level of construction practices that's unknown for this job, but we have seen instances of that side of things being a cause of the uneven substrate. So I just want to throw that topic out there. But I guess what I'm curious of, and I don't know if Phil and Mark, there's kind of two questions here. Do you, can either of you summarize what degree of construction administration services this project had seen? Like, were you out there regularly to see how the contractor was doing things? Were there field reports documenting? Were there mock-ups? Things like that that might help talk to that point of construction.
Yeah, there were mock-ups before any major construction installation, and roof certainly would have been one of them. And pre-construction meetings to the extent needed for masonry, ABB, roofing, and so forth. We had weekly meetings. We did have a part-time clerk, and then COVID hit right in the middle of the project. So it was a bad combination between, it was a cost-saving measure to have a part-time clerk. And those hours were reduced during COVID when everybody was remote and the world was on fire and nobody could go near anybody else and so forth. So I'd have to go back to see what was happening during that time in March, April, May, that time of year. But in general, to your point, there was oversight, there were weekly meetings, there were field reports, and so forth.
Do such documents still readily exist that, I don't know if you had a chance to look through them recently or not, or I guess, let me stick with the first question. Are those documents available?
They still exist. I have to go through, they've already been archived on our software, so I'd have to go back and pull them up. I don't know, Patrick, if you still have the hard copies that were distributed as far as meeting minutes and Carl's daily reports. And I should note, Phil could probably back this up, our clerk was very detail oriented. In fact, now he's the building inspector for the city of Chicopee. So, so we had somebody of that level, that knowledge base, overseeing everything when he was on site.
Second question has to do, I guess, more during the design development phase of this project. So, you know, Phil, or Philip, I don't know which one you prefer, but
Whatever works.
great. Do you recall having discussions with either the town of Hadley or the Hadley Public Library about the pros and cons of providing what you're calling a hot roof, an asphalt shingle in this region? To that idea, most, if not all, asphalt shingle manufacturers that I'm aware of require ventilation to even obtain a warranty. And we can go back and forth on the pros and cons of having that ventilation above and beyond just the warranty of the asphalt shingles. So can you speak to that at all?
It's been enough time now that I do recall having these conversations, but I don't remember them in enough detail to be able to tell you what the meat of those discussions was. And I'm sure we talked about the pros and cons of both approaches. I know that, as I said, we've done both vented and unvented on other public buildings, and it's typically a case-by-case basis for us in terms of what works best and what we're recommending. I think there was a couple of things, as I mentioned, that kind of led us toward the hot roof for this building. And I do recall talking about those with the building committee, but not the specifics of those conversations.
I know that's something that, at least that I would have hoped that was discussed at the time as a caveat, unless something was different 5 years ago, which I don't think it was. You proceed this way, very good chance you don't get a warranty from the shingle manufacturer on your roof. So I just want to touch on that a little bit. You had noted the idea of doing a solid substrate below the joints in the asphalt, in the plywood sheathing. Typically, when we have designed roofs, our go-to basis of design is doing actually that batten system where you use 2x as your vented space. You can even gap those as well, because that's a solid wood substrate, and you can space them to be at those joints in the plywood. That's something we prefer, purely that, it provides more of a rigid structure. It's more controllable of what you're fastening, and so I'm not fully sold on the vented, the vented or unvented nail-based insulation materials that come from the factory. We're still looking into that, but anyways, something we prefer to have is those batten systems instead of the prefab systems.
Just to be clear, and Phil, you can confirm, this is, John, a warrantyable roof system. There was a warranty. Manufacturers do stand by hot roof systems. And so this wasn't an alternative direction that was taken to save money or something like that, and with the knowledge that you couldn't get a warranty. It was designed per manufacturer's recommendations.
Can you expand on that? Do you have a documented warranty for this particular project that you recall? Whether you remember it or have seen it recently, I guess, do you recall seeing a warranty come through from GAF for this job?
It should be in the closeout documents. I'd have to look with all the warranties and affidavits and so forth.
Okay, I would definitely be interested in seeing that document. If I recall correctly, GAF again was called and looked at the roof. They didn't say much in their 4-page report, but I believe they talk about the lack of ventilation. And when you read the literature, at least modern day literature, there's ways to look up literature from manufacturers from 5-10 years ago as well. But everything I've seen, it's a requirement to obtain a warranty. I'd just be interested in seeing if that warranty is clear, if it exists, and if it was filed for a commercial building as opposed to a residential building too.
Okay, I would like to have the trustees move on to the rest of their meeting. If there are any other pressing questions that occur to someone, either please be in touch with Patrick or get in touch with me, and we will see if we can facilitate the questions and the answers. Thank you very much, Mark and Phil and John, for coming, as well as our other guests. I really appreciate it and all of the information. Thank you very much, and we'll see you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye, guys.
It's a good thing we didn't run out of electricity battery.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Is there a chance we can see if they're going to follow up on that warranty? That there was a warranty? He seemed to say there was one, but he doesn't know where it is. And
No, there is a warranty, because we filed a claim against the warranty. And so that was,
so that's in progress?
no, it was not, I mean, it was the manufacturer declined to fund any sort of replacement of the shingles, because they essentially said it was a defect of partially it was a defect of the design, because they were noting the lack of ventilation, and that's what John is sort of pointing to here. So that's kind of one of the things that we've been sort of following on, and that's really what he was, I was surprised he was that pointed about it, but essentially, as he was saying, by virtue of having put those shingles, that specific product with that specific warranty on this specific roof as designed, it essentially voided the warranty. And, so that's kind of, yeah.
Bummer.
I would like to, and I'd be willing to do this, go back through the building committee minutes and check and see about discussion about roof. So
I've already done that. The unfortunate thing is that the real question here, to my mind anyway, is what happened at that decision point. What happened as far as any required re-engineering of the roof, and that's really the information that only resides on the end of the design team, because they're the ones that then said, hey engineers, change of plan. We're going to have a different type of roof.
Right, so the
Yeah.
question I have that I feel like I don't have a clear answer on,
Yes.
and maybe I'm missing something, is I wasn't at every building committee meeting, I was at some, you both were at everyone, as was Molly, but that at one point, we were talking about a metal roof, and I'm still a little confused if the discussion about the vented roof happened after we decided to go shingle or when we were going metal.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying.
And I feel like I don't know either. And would the minutes maybe help us with that?
So we can look at, I have a
happy
binder
to-
where, because I went
I
through
have a Christmas break.
I went through all of the minutes. Well, I could just let you take the binder. But I went through all of the minutes looking for any references to the roof. Anywhere that they occurred, I copied them out and put them all in one place, so you can
Great.
just go through and read the sequence of
Will that
events.
make
There's
a difference?
There's no smoking gun on that.
It does, to me, it makes a difference, because if they design, remember the venting and unventing has to do with asphalt or metal, right? So when we wanted the metal roof, then you don't need the vented roof underneath, because the metal roof itself is vented.
But what will knowing that change about our
Right, it doesn't
situation?
change the situation we have.
It won't change the situation, but it might change the course of action.
If they should have redesigned the bed of the roof, knowing that we weren't going to be able to fund a metal roof, sometimes it's not that easy just to switch over to asphalt. Sometimes you have to redesign everything.
But so then all you're doing is finding someone to lay blame to. But it still
Yeah,
doesn't
that
help
would
what
solve
we
the problem.
have
Right.
currently up there.
Right, but that's like, we may or may not have to, like, we may or
We're-
may not have to find someone to.
I mean, again, the whole point of what we're doing here is to collect as much information about the sequence of events and what, because again, none of the people, very few of the people in the room at the time when we were doing the construction and design work were building professionals themselves. So we, of course, listened to, you know, what came from the experts, and the experts said, well, it would be a good idea, for instance, to, you know, to go with a hot roof. Okay, that sounds good. And, you know, you're gonna have a metal roof, fine. And then it was sort of, you know, again, it was sort of when you're already riding that horse, when you're told, well, the metal's gonna be too expensive, we're gonna have to switch to shingles. But then no one mentioned that there could be a complication with that. And that's where we wanna know. And so again, we're just collecting the information. We're not in any position to really do much of anything beyond that. But the town itself has an interest in then taking this information and making its own decision about, you know, how to proceed.
Was Mark Sullivan on that deciding committee?
He was our project
He's a
manager.
professional roofer.
No,
Well,
He's a professional builder.
He's a builder.
Builder.
Contractor.
he was our
He was the
OPM.
OPM. He was the project manager that worked on behalf of the town to oversee the project to make sure that it was successful. So that
It was his company, Wayne, that built the Newman Center at UMass and other things. This is what he does.
But he was not the builder. He was not the builder.
But he should have had questions to ask that would have.
Certainly.
These weren't
I'm sorry, I
unprofessional.
just have a little bit of confusion here. So if the roof was warranted by GAF, if you had a warranty to begin with by from GIF, the shingle people, and they knew what the roof was, I mean, that it was a hot roof, that it wasn't vented, and then they come back and say, I'm sorry, the warranty doesn't work because you don't have a vented roof. I don't understand.
Well, when you buy, yes, but I don't know that GAF, I don't think GAF or any manufacturer, it's just like if I go buy four
Okay.
tires and put them on the wrong, I
So
bought
you
four snow tires and
presume,
put
I
them on
mean,
a
not you
motorcycle,
per
they might say
se,
that's not covered.
but the building committee or whoever made this decision to go to the asphalt roof, presumed that in buying these shingles, they would be warranted.
Properly installed.
Properly
Installed.
Well, but the question then is it vented or not vented? I mean,
I'm not sure if that question was asked.
We're
And
not
wouldn't
roof
they
residents.
just
I don't
ask
know
that
if they
they
do
just
that.
said, well, we're
Yeah.
going to install these shingles and they have a warranty on them and that's great, right? And then
It
we
isn't
find
as though
out.
the building committee chose the specific shingles.
Of course they didn't, but if they chose
But-
even another kind of shingle that had a warranty, 10-year
The
warranty. or something.
contractor and certainly the roofing installer should have been aware of the conditions established by the manufacturer for the installation and for ending up with a warranty that was valid.
Right,
Yeah.
so they should.
And so there's.
They knew
there's-
that they were doing a hot roof, and therefore, they should have known that, you know, a shingle maker would probably not.
And that's the
warranty it.
crux of what John is pointing
Yeah,
at.
right.
That's what he's sort of doggedly pointing
yeah,
to and saying, you basically used the wrong product for the application that.
Yeah.
This is a real test of recollections. I remember actually voting for a metal roof that was my father was a carpenter, and in New England, you always do the very best job on the basements and the roofs.
I'll second that.
Now we know. I don't think we had that bit of information. We couldn't afford the metal roof. The alternate was to go with an asphalt roof. I don't think we knew this piece about hot roof, venting, and all of that. That was a big gap.
I don't recall that either.
Right.
That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I don't recall it. Wayne?
The samples that they uncovered, badly done stuff. There were mistakes in the building of the roof. And they suspect there are bigger mistakes, other places that they didn't uncover.
Well,
Well, we have no idea.
there's no way of
but, I mean,
knowing that,
that's-
but the reason that they
That's why we
selected.
got a pro, and he told us.
Yes, but the reason that they selected the areas that they did cut to look at was because they could see that there was something going on from the infrared imaging. That's why they went there. They didn't just randomly select places on the roof. They went where they suspected there was a problem, confirmed that there was a problem, And they can sort of extrapolate from that potentially if the, standard of construction and the materials used were of a similar quality, that over time, if you came back and did another infrared inspection, you might find, oh, here's a new wet spot, or if, as they're suggesting, again, for more bucks, they can come back and fine tune the IR drone and then maybe get into more detail. Why they didn't do that in the first place, I don't know, but that's what they're suggesting that they could do, and we may find that there are more small areas of problematic moisture.
Then my question would be, does that help us make, I mean, not that we're at the point of making a decision, but will more data, more tests help us make a decision about what to do going forward, or the
It
select
might
board
help the
what to do?
town, it might help the town to make the decision.
Yeah, we're not going to make the decision.
No.
Joanne?
I disagree with that. I think we will have to be part of the decision, as we are the stewards of the building.
Good luck with that.
But, well, it's in our job responsibility.
It was
It's
in your
like-
job responsibility the first time.
And we built the building. So
Right,
we're
so I think
responsible for the maintenance of the building.
And we have a problem now, as with anything that's a problem. We're trying to make sure that if there is responsibility out there, that the people that are responsible for those kinds of decisions have that information, because they haven't really done, unfortunately, under the previous town administration, they were not really able to do this on their own.
And that's what I want to say, is that one of the things for folks who weren't on the building committee and weren't here when we built it, and we took care of the Goodwin when we were there, and that's why it's in as good of a shape as it is, right? Because the trustees are the stewards of the building. And one of the things we had repeatedly during this process, this building process, was that the subcontractors used, which you as a town, as a library, when we contracted, we had to go with the lowest bidder unless we had some outstanding reason why the lowest bidder wasn't appropriate for the job. The bidder that built this building and has never built in, like, I'm sure we could look, but has probably, from what I know, and not built in Massachusetts again. They came from Connecticut, and multiple subcontractors that they used gave us many problems, and one of them went out of business. Like, so.
Well, do we have any guarantee that if we do it again, the same process won't take place?
No, because of state law.
Because of what?
State law requires on bid items that you take the lowest bidder, unless there is some compelling reason to render them unqualified.
But the problem was not with the low bid. The problem was with the materials that you decided to go with.
No, the problem was
Well,
that the subcontract, so you go and you bid a builder. So we had a builder build this building. The builder doesn't do everything in the building. They subcontract out a lot of what happens in the building. They choose their subcontractors. So the roof might have been subcontracted out to one person. The grounds were subcontracted out to somebody else.
The electrical and
We
plumbing
have,
and the
you
finishing.
have no say in
No.
that.
That's
The
not the
builder,
impression I got from what we heard.
that,
What we
No,
heard.
that's the way.
That is
That's
how
completely
building
the way
goes.
it
Whoa,
was.
whoa, whoa. Decisions were made by the town about the nature of the roof.
Yes, but not about the
Not the contractor, not who installed it, not who, once the builder, the company that builds the building is awarded the contract, they hire the subcontractors. Those are the people who come in and do the work. They use the material that is spec'd out for them.
And the design.
And the
Yes.
design. But when he talks about the plywood being uneven, or the
Or the
clear
spray
story
foam
not
not-
being
yeah.
insulated, or the
Or
spray
properly
foam being
caulked. Right.
missing, all of that is the quality of work done by the builder or the subcontractor. That's not the materials.
What about the inspector, the town inspector? Was there not an inspector who?
There was a
looked
town
at this?
inspector.
Well, we were also transitioning between two inspectors at the time.
But there's.
So
Can
why
I
didn't anybody
please
call
suggest
attention to
that
this?
because we do have an awful lot of stuff
Yeah,
to get
sorry.
through, I'm
Yeah.
not sure that,
I just don't want it to happen again.
Well, I think with
I
the
mean, that's-
nature of public contracts, I think it happens on so many buildings that are built for towns, for the state. Look at
Right.
UMass over and over with all the roof repairs on the Fine Arts Center and everything else. It's an ongoing issue, all the time.
So are we going to do it again?
no, because right now, I am going to make a motion to accept the minutes of November 12th. Is there a second?
I second that.
Is there any discussion about the content of the meeting minutes? In that case, I will ask for a vote to accept. All in favor? Thank you very much. Director's report.
Director's report.
That's you.
That's what you mean. So, for the sake of just moving things along here, if anyone has any questions about the things that were in the report, please ask. But the things that I want to talk about, well, first of all, we do have and it may be on the agenda, but we have the second reading of the Wi-Fi hotspot lending policy to get through. I don't know if there was any further discussion on that, but we're very much looking forward to being able to actively loan out hotspots to members of the public, and to be able to provide that policy to them when we do so.
I have a little bit of wordsmithing that you are welcome to accept or not accept. I don't think that it doesn't substantively change anything, so I'm not going to get into each of those things. I would strongly recommend that there be a single page. On one side is the lending policy, and then on the other side is whatever form you are asking or whatever information you are requesting from the borrower.
Sure.
That's essentially all that I have to say.
But then when you do that, then the borrower who fills out that side hands it back and doesn't have a copy of the policy for
Exactly.
themselves.
Good point. Then the form is separate.
We can do that. That's
That's what you were thinking
typically what
anyway.
we've done when we did.
Oh,
when we
okay,
do
that's
the
fine.
policy, like we do when we have the meeting room application. It's a packet that's stapled together, and essentially at the end of it, you tear off half,
Yeah.
and you can
Okay.
tear
Oh, that's
the
fine.
other half.
Yeah.
And that way they always have a physical reference.
Yeah.
Do you, technically, for the sake of protocol, do you have to read this? You were saying another reading of this? Or?
It is brought forward for consideration and discussion a second time, rather than just you're presented with something, who knows how long before, and you're asked to make a final decision. Things like policies and bylaws, we give people extra chances to think about and
And I
express an opinion.
suspect it also gives members of the public an opportunity to come in and comment. I heard they were going to, enact this policy or that policy. They can come in and actually speak.
I thought Jack was going to give us a dramatic reading.
No, I am not planning on that.
I was looking forward to that.
It's been a long day, Jan.
Are there any comments or recommendations with respect to the substance of the proposed lending policy?
Is the $100 replacement fee significant enough to cover the cost of the Wi-Fi unit?
Yes, and it's as much about covering the time administratively that it would require to go through the work of replacing it.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the policy as written.
Second. Any further discussion? All in favor? Thank you.
Wonderful. I would also just like to highlight the fact that and sort of explain my thinking on this. But you may have noticed here that we now have the small collection bins for the requirement for lead to collect batteries, cell phones, eyeglasses. I don't know why eyeglasses. I never figured that out, but there is a collection point for that. And you may recall that about a year ago we got a quote after I sort of checked in with other libraries that had gone through the lead thing, and there was a company that provided cabinetry. It was quite expensive. We talked about like, well, what other solutions were there? And of course, I have a hard time committing to paying a lot for a piece of furniture that, like, what if we didn't get certified? Do we need to have $1,000 cabinet to do this? So I figured, as long as we're meeting the requirement, if this becomes a long-term commitment, we'll go back to it and revisit it then. But this should be adequate for the time being, and that's why I went with the $5.99 option on collecting those materials. And I am looking forward to starting transferring those materials and going to the landfill, which was very cooperative in terms of the transfer station, in terms of accepting at least the batteries. I think the electronics probably will still have to be routed to possibly the Staples, because I don't think they really address whether they would take that or not.
And right now, would that fall onto you? Who is actually going to do the moving of the materials?
We're just gonna have to see, because again, I don't have access to the transfer. I mean, they're probably not going to require me to have a permit to go to the transfer station to do that, but I don't know. We didn't really get into that level of detail. We'll see. Yeah, I'm sure someone here has a sticker for the transfer station, but we'll get to that when we actually put it in. But yeah, I mean, it's good to know for members of the public to know that this is a collection point for that, and for the time being, you call us if you have questions about that. But because there are some finer points to what we can accept and what just goes in the trash.
I don't think the DPW would have some involvement in all of that as well, especially the pickup and transfer over to the
transfer
dump.
station.
Yeah, transfer station.
You might think.
I might.
Maybe it would be something that you can talk about with Mike.
Certainly.
And if that avenue is not available, we will come up with something else.
Yeah, but I mean, it's certainly, at this point, it doesn't look like it's going to present like a huge burden. But if it's becoming, a constant, then it's worth a push.
Between now and our next trustees meeting, do you expect that you'll set up this collection station?
It's out on the counter, so it's out on the.
All right.
It's sort of by where the print on the counter, next to where the printer is. So like closer to the children's room, you'll just see 3 colored plastic bins with lids on them, and a sign next to each saying what each one does, and with a little information as required. So it's there and it's in operation. And then the last thing, and maybe this is the most important thing that I wanted to talk about with you all, was that I had mentioned previously, and it's mentioned in here, that we had gone to the Friends, as we have done. I think this is the 3rd year that we've done it, to make our presentation as far as our request for items to be funded, whether it's support for materials. The Friends pay for our New York Times subscription. For on the one hand, what's that?
Museum passes.
Museum passes. They pay for things on the material side. They also pay for in support of library programming. So a lot of what we do in the summer for children's summer reading and adult and YA programming, they support it. So they supported us to the tune of, I think it was $7,500 roughly. And so I had suggested at the last meeting that I would like to follow the same model relative to Charlotte Smith and make a presentation for, again, an annual ask from the Charlotte Smith Fund, so that we start beginning to utilize that money, which has grown at last count. It's up to $469,475. It's a lot. I mean, it started at $350. It's really kind of remarkable how quickly that's grown. And so what we have here, the breakdown, I'm going to go in reverse order from smallest to highest. $2,000 in support of the Library of Things for additional acquisitions of equipment that we can loan out to the public. So that could be anything from additional musical instruments or sewing machines, or you name it. that would go a long way towards helping us to grow that collection. We also received some donations. We just received a very nice donation of an electronic keyboard, a Casio keyboard that you can use to practice playing piano. So that was very nice. And we have a couple of other things to add. $3,500 for the purpose of adult programming, and $4,500 for general youth programming. So that would cover both programs for children and young adults. And if you recall, last year we dipped into the Charlotte Smith funds, and $4,200 was provided, and we used that specifically for summer reading programming this past summer. And we used it quite successfully. The programs were well attended. It was money well spent. And then lastly, and this is the one that where I felt like I was being quite bold in asking this, but what we really need to do, I think, to move in the direction that I sense that both the trustees would like us to, as well as the public, just based on the feedback that we've gotten from various, the focus group that we did in here, the survey. There's an appetite for additional programming. There's particularly an appetite for programming geared towards adults. We're doing quite well with programming for children and youth because we're sort of staffed for it, but we're less able to do that for adults because we're just very flat out. So what I'm suggesting is that we would that the trustees would approve the use of $19,760 to fund a 19-hour per week programming librarian position, and that's estimating it as a $20 an hour pay rate. What I'm hoping to do, and to make a long story short, what I would like to do is I'm going to put this in the budget. I'm going to make this part of the budget ask for this year, assuming that follows the ground rules that are set out by the select board for how we present the ask. They may say, no, level funding. I don't know what the budgetary situation is because we haven't really gotten that brief yet. But assuming that there's an opening for us to do that, I'm going to put that in the budget and try to get that through in the ordinary way. But if they were to say, well, we're going to give you some money but not enough money, what we would do is that we wouldn't spend all the $19,000. We'd spend whatever amount was needed to get to the full funding of that position. So it's kind of like an up to proposition for that. In order for us to do that, it also would give us the ability to potentially advertise and hire for this position before July. This is something we'd rather do sooner than later, rather than waiting until the new budget's, the new budget year. Yes.
Do we know how much, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how much money we get every year in interest from, or an average, because I know it's probably invested, from the Charlotte Smith money? Maybe I could explain where my mind's going about, like, if I've usually been opposed to funding salaries, right? But times are different. People, I'm thinking if there's a sustainable amount that, like, we're not, just so that we're not draining, not that it's easy to drain 400, but it can be. Sure. If we could find out how much we've made every year. I didn't know if you expect us to vote tonight, or if we could, if it's a quick ask, to find the annual.
Well, what I can tell you about that is that it varies from year to year.
Yeah, of course, right, it's the market, right, I know that.
The year before, it was fairly flat. Not much was happening, whereas this year, I think this fund gained something like $70,000.
Right, see, so that 70,000 actually covers the flat year and this year, if you look at your ask.
Well, if you're going to look at that if you're going to look at the interest on the investment, that's not an endowment.
Right.
As
looking at kind of
whatever. What you really would want to do is look at a 5-year rolling average.
Yeah.
But the thing is, where is your sweet spot? Where, is there some number below which you don't want the fund to go? Or is the trustees' approach, there aren't going to be any new funds other than interest added to it? Do we just go through it, you know, maybe however many decades out, but are you looking at it as trying to are you looking at sort of it trying to be an endowment and you're only going to spend the interest?
So
Income versus capital. I mean,
And before we go too far down this road, as I'm saying, it's my intention, sort of in the same way that we've used state aid funds to just to help us bolster our staffing. We've used state aid to fund our sub roster. So anytime someone comes in to fill because someone's away on vacation, that's being paid for out of state aid. We use state aid. Not this current year, but previously, because if you remember, we increased Sue Brown's hours from, I don't remember what they were exactly, but they were like, I think she was at 27. We were able to get through in the budget, get her up to 32, and then we used state aid to get her all the way to full time. And that was a temporary situation until the next year when we were able to fully fund her position through the normal means. And so this is like a strategy for a transition to be able to kind of create this position and then try to incorporate it. Whether it takes 1 year or 2 is an open question, but the idea here is not to, on an annual basis, be coming in and taking that much money out of Charlottesville. This is more or less a one-time or potentially two-time ask if we.
But you do see this
Yeah.
as a standing position, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I think what I'm asking the group is like really what you were saying. Like, I think we need to philosophically have the conversation. I'm not opposed to what you're asking. That's not I'm just thinking philosophically we need to have this kind of discussion about funds. One of the reasons I did it at the Friends, and I kind of really pushed, or they supported me, so I wouldn't say I pushed, but I really advocated for us to do that, was that it helped us know how much money we had to raise every year if we wanted to keep a certain amount in our account, right? Like, so I'm not opposed to what you're saying at all. I'm just saying, I wonder if at some point, not tonight, we can look at the bigger picture of like how we use our funds and save our
Absolutely, and I
funds.
think
Like,
that
can we
also-
put that on the bucket, on the long-term list?
That also ties into the larger conversation about what is the strategy
Correct.
for fundraising generally.
Correct.
In some ways, you're almost treating that as a bit of an endowment. It's not necessarily a
Yes.
bad thing.
Yes.
I just wonder what will happen long-term with something like the roof. Would anyone say you should use that fund first before going to other town funds? You know,
Yeah, no,
Yes.
it's
And they will.
possible.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, sorry, to address the cost of the roof, is that, yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we do have a building fund, a capital campaign fund, I mean, that's the Hadley Library Fund, which currently has roughly $300,000.
Yeah, it's
in it.
$300,000 in it.
And that, you know, could be drawn on along with.
And that
other
is
trust funds.
specifically, when we made that, it says for capital improvements on the building. So that is there.
That is distinct from the solar panel fund.
Oh, that's part of, that also
Okay.
incorporates the solar panels.
All
Yeah,
right.
that's also.
Okay.
And we might get more money if we get certified to be a LEED building?
Yeah, have you heard anything else on that? Okay.
So are you asking us to vote on that tonight?
I move that the trustees authorize up to $29,760 from the Smith Fund to be used for programming things, Library of Things, and a programming librarian part-time position.
I second that.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Thank you.
Wonderful.
Do you have anything else?
Those are the things that I came here.
Okay.
uh,
Then we, I shared with you in advance of the meeting the second update of the bylaws based upon the conversation that we had in November. And I wondered if, I did not hear anything back from anyone else in terms of additional changes or comments. And so I will ask for a motion to adopt the revised bylaws.
I so move.
Second?
Second.
Is there any further discussion? Does anybody want to change a comma or a quotation mark or anything else? In that case, all in favor? Oh, thank you. On strategic planning, do you guys want to say anything?
Yeah, I think that when Patrick and I met, we talked about like, well, our next steps and looking at the data that was given. And when we talked it through, we both thought it was important that we open it up to staff and to any trustees that wanted to join us. We're not requiring anyone, but at first we said, well, we should call in. And then I said, well, there might be trustees that want to join this small working group. So I had asked Lynn if we could set that date tonight for that next meeting, thinking if anyone's interested, express it, and then we'll include you on the planning of that date. And Patrick can speak for staff, and we could set that date tonight. So with that, I ask if anyone is interested in joining us.
Could you describe the working group?
So we are looking at the data, we're coming up with a long-range plan for the library using the data that was collected, and now we're going to decide what are the holes, what do we need, what next steps do we need to do with the data? Do we need to get data in different ways? We've collected surveys. Do we need to have, what do we want to find out more about? Do we need to have small groups? We need like a thinking group.
What's the data telling you?
Reading the data, all that. And I felt like it would just be better if there were any trustees that were interested that we had more input. So that's what I'm putting out there. I'm trying to force anyone. I'm trying to be welcoming.
May I suggest that in 2 days' time you send an email to everybody to give them the time to think about it, and then ask all of us to reply to you either yes or no, so you make sure that you hear from all of us.
Is that okay if I do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We had talked last time about the extent to which we might like to look at the library and see if there are additional good citizen ways or beyond that we would like to make the building more accessible. And Patrick has sort of remembered this review, and I sent you the link to the select board meeting where the report that was first discussed a year ago was presented to the select board, and I also included the however many page report
218.
that it was.
Yeah.
My printer thanks you.
Double-sided, I hope.
And I had a snow day, not a snow month.
Anyway, we do not need, fortunately, we're not the worst compliant. We don't meet some standards on a couple of items.
That's putting it mildly.
Well, compared to, it's all relative, Wayne. It's all relative.
Compared to the good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
And
I think compared to like other buildings.
Anyway,
Right, right,
it doesn't matter. So I had asked at the time that I sent all of that out, if anyone were interested in working on accessibility, and Susan said she would be willing to do so. I have since taken the data that was in this and not particularly accessible as far as I was concerned, and put it into a spreadsheet and then used color to say what are the high priorities, what is the degree of feasibility, and is something in the immediate or near term, and then in terms of what the potential cost of these things, recognizing that they're just estimates. But I think it would help to some degree to identify little things that we could do, and then to perhaps consider developing some kind of accessibility plan over time to undertake things such as we discussed before, of having motorized interior doors. Would we want to do the same for doors into the children's room, etc.? If there is anyone who would like to work with Susan and Patrick on that, let me know. Otherwise, I will send them my spreadsheet, and then they can come back and, I mean, it should be easy and quick, so I don't know that we need necessarily someone else to work on it, but I think between Susan and Patrick, that would be a good start to come up with some kind of timeline or plan in terms of moving ahead. I mean, some things are change the height of pick a thing, even if it's mounted on a ceramic wall, fine. But to look at the things, at the items on the list and any others that we might identify in terms of creating our own priorities rather than strictly following those that are based on federal and state standards. So I think that's the way to go in terms of addressing those items. It is my understanding that the select board does not have any overarching plan to go through that report and spend their time and money dealing with things. What I was told is that
So they're going to stay out of compliance with ADA?
I don't think they're all ADA compliant. I think they're wishes.
If you haven't done work on a thing,
Right.
up to, I think 30% or something like
Yes.
that is the
We
trigger.
went through that with the good one.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you don't have to be
Yeah, it's,
compliant. It's, and you know, Patrick and I were talking about this today, and his sort of characterization, and I agree, is as good citizens and trustees of the library, what do we think our good citizen responsibility is
Great.
toward the residents and patrons in order to do the best we can within the means we have available? If something is an inch and a half more or less, if something is 0.7 degrees off, whatever the standard is, my guess is that one of those kinds of things is not going to be at the top of the list to address. But this helps provide some kind of a starting point, and my hope is that Susan and Patrick will apply real life standards in addition to what we can reasonably expect those who would do the work to be able to have it done and done satisfactorily and go on from there.
I'll be happy to.
You want to help with that? Okay. You've got two bodies. Okay. Is there anything else? Then I would be delighted to entertain a motion to adjourn.
I don't want to always be the one to do this.
Go right ahead, please do.
Hold on, before this meeting comes to a close, you know, being on the building committee for this library, I can certainly speak for myself and maybe for some of my colleagues. I think we were making every decision with the best intentions.
Yeah.
And I think when we were sitting there listening to experts say do this or that, or if we were trying to decide, do you want to go with a metal roof that you just can't afford, or happy to go with asphalt that you can't afford, we did not know that there were hot roofs and cold roofs and some of these other constraints. And we made the best decisions we could that day, that time. It's a very complicated process. I hope every building in the future is built to, you know, great standards, but I
worked in the Fine Arts Center for 35 years, so I totally understand
Yeah.
what's going on.
So
Yeah.
is this,
So I just wanted to say
No,
that.
that's fine. That's fine. Well, and sometimes we were
It
asked
should
to
be
vote
the
on
14th
something
of January.
after just having been told whatever. So there was no real time to
Right.
go and process and think about stuff. Anyway, okay. All in favor of adjourning? Thank you.